Michael Bend, author of the ABeCeDarian Reading Program. This video is the second in a series on correcting a student's oral reading errors. In the introductory video, I demonstrated a basic template for correcting errors. Let's review that briefly. When a student misreads a word, the teacher should echo the student's response slowly, dragging his finger under the word, point out the mismatch explicitly, and then have the student tap and say the word to try again. So if the student looked at the word mop and said map, the teacher would reply this way. You said map with an ah here, but we have an ah. Tap and say, and try again, please. All of the errors I reviewed in the first video were substitution errors. That is, the student's mispronunciation was the result of substituting one sound for another, for instance, saying map for mop. However, there are several other kinds of errors a student could make when doing oral reading. Your response to these kinds of errors should follow the same basic template we've reviewed, with just a slight variation in wording when you're pointing out the mismatch. A student could omit a sound in a word, for instance saying fog when he sees the word frog. Here's the correction for that. You said fog without the r here. You need to say the r. Tap and say, and try again, please. Another error a student could make would be to add a sound. For instance, saying slip when he sees the word sip. Here's your correction. You said slip with a l here, but there is no l. Tap and say, and try again, please. Sometimes a student will say a word that shares no sounds with the printed word. This will usually be because the student is just guessing or because he knows the meaning of the target word and has access to synonym. For instance, a student might say bed for cot or police for cop. In that case, you don't really have to point out how far off the student's word was. You can just proceed with the standard substitution error correction, pointing out that the first letter doesn't match. For instance, if the student looks at the word cot and says bed, you should say, you said bed with a b here, but we have a k. Tap and say, and try again, please. As a student works through level A, he goes from reading 3-sound words such as mop and sat and run to reading 4-sound words like flip and must and stop. Some students who read 3-sound words very well experience a little bit of difficulty when they start reading 4-sound words because of the increased cognitive demands of the task. Specifically, 4-sound words place a greater demand on working memory than 3-sound words. And some students simply can't hold on to all 4 sounds after they've done a tap and say. Another potential problem is that synchronizing the mouth movements to say a 4-sound word is considerably more difficult than doing so for a 3-sound word. So we've got 2 kinds of potential problems. One is a problem with memory, and one is a production problem involving coordinating the mouth movements. Fortunately, there is a very simple but extremely effective technique that deals with both kinds of difficulties. For instance, suppose the student is having difficulty reading the word soft. What you should do is cover up the last sound t and have him sound out the first 3 sounds. S, ah, f, soft. As soon as he can pronounce that word as a syllable, soft, expose the t and have him blend those 2 parts. Soft. What's the word? Soft. Notice that in the word soft, there were 2 consonants at the end of the word. Some 4-sound words, however, have 2 consonants at the beginning, as in the word flip. If a student has difficulty reading a word with 2 consonants at the beginning, provide support this way. Cover up the 3rd and 4th letters of the word and have him sound out the first 2 consonant sounds. F, l, fl. Once he can do that stably, then remove the card, expose the other letters, and then he blends fl, I, p, flip. Please note that in ABeCeDarian we do not teach consonant blends as units the way some phonics programs do. It's inaccurate to teach consonant blends as units because they're really combinations of 2 or 3 individual sounds, and doing so adds a tremendous amount of unnecessary work. If a student has difficulty reading a word with a consonant blend, help him read that word using the technique I just showed you. Doing that will give the student all the support he needs to read these words well as making your instruction crystal clear and keeping your workload manageable. Once you become comfortable correcting student errors with these techniques, you're ready to add something to your response to make it even more effective. One of the most important messages you should be conveying to your students is what they read should make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, that means there's a problem and they have to go back and fix it. Here's a way to convey that message simply, consistently, and systematically. If your student is reading a list of isolated words and says something that's not a real word, begin your error correction by saying, "Is that a real word?" And if your student is reading some sentences and makes an error, an oral reading error, begin your error correction by saying, "Does that make sense?" If a student looks at the word jam, for instance, and says jat, and this was on an isolated list of words, you would say, "Is jat a real word?" And after the student responded, and you would say, "We better try that word again," and then go on with the regular correction. You said jat with a t here, but we have tap and say, and try again, please. Now let's try a correction when the error occurs when the student is reading a sentence. If a student looks at this sentence, for example, and says, "I am hot, but I am not sat," you would respond, "Does that make any sense? I am not sat? We better try that again." And then you would proceed with the regular error correction. You said sat with a t here, but we have d. For a written version of the information contained in this video, please go to the web address on the screen and click on the link for the ABeCeDarian Error Correction Guide. If you have any comments, please write to me. I'd love to hear from you. Happy teaching!